Cyprus, the counterintelligence podcast, hosted by IXN Solutions, the company you turn to for corporate counterintelligence expertise and creators of 351X.
And we're live. Scott Sparks. Good afternoon, my friend. Welcome back to the studio.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. It's good to be back in the old hot seat here, co-hosting with you today.
Man, I'm looking forward to it. I think the last time we did this, it was pretty fun, man. I see you got your IXN swag shirt on. I'm awfully excited about that. I'm sporting it as well. But hey, I got a question for you, brother. So, Dallas and Green Bay. I know our episode won't be published for about a week or so, but what happened, man?
Yeah, that was depends on your perspective, right? So, but it was heartbreaking, right? You never want to end in a tie, but it's better than a loss. So it was a bit heartbreaking. The Dallas offense is, it's pretty potent, and they got the job done. But unless defense comes into play and keeps the bad guys off the board, you're not gonna have a winning season, right? So it's just like CI. You need offense and defense, right? Boom, there you go. See what I did there?
I love what you did there. You just need to identify, exploit, neutralize those threats through defensive and proactive measures. Boom, well played, Scott. And yeah, for the fantasy football players out there, I bet they were happy to see that overtime and extend as long as it did. And Scott, I know I didn't play you, but I saw your score that helped you out quite a bit.
Yeah, fantasy football is the one time where, overtime, unless you were losing going into overtime, that's the one time where overtime, definitely benefits you as long as you're the one with players still on the board. It's scary, when your opponent does.
True statement. Well, all right, let's get into it, Scott. So, to our audience out there, I've had the pleasure to work with our guest, Colin. Boy, I don't even know how many years ago it was, but it was a fantastic opportunity. Transitioned in, took over as the S3 of the foreign counterintelligence activity. When I was over there as the chief operations, I learned so much. The energy, the motivation, the directions, the no fearness. I saw our guest go toe-to-toe with some Army seniors who ultimately said, "You're right." And it was amazing. Always stood in line to push the right thing to be done. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Lieutenant Colonel retired Colin Pascal. Good afternoon, brother. How you doing?
Good afternoon, Jeremy. Thank you for having me. Scott, it's good to see you. And thank you for putting this show on, because there are not enough people that understand CI and think about CI, and both of you are helping to change that.
We like to hear that. We like to have a platform for CI out there, and that's what we're trying to do over here at Cyprus. And, Colin, thanks in advance for submitting to walking through your Army journey, which really ended just a little bit ago, brother. Yeah?
Yeah, it did. It retired in July 1st, 2024 was my first day as a retired soldier for life. So I can still say last year for a few more months.
That's right. You got a couple more. That's great, Colin. Hey, so why don't we kick it off? There's a lot of services out there. You have the Air Force, you have the Navy, you have the Coast Guard. We won't say the Marines to our Marine brethren out there. You're just the Department of the Navy. Why the Army?
I went to a military high school, a boarding military high school, and I actually had sent myself there, which is a little unusual. But probably from the time I was 12 or 13 years old, I knew that I wanted to be in some type of service. I used to think that I wanted to go to the Coast Guard Academy, and then I thought the Naval Academy. And ultimately, my math scores were never going to be good enough to get me into any of those places. And I ended up at a great school in upstate New York called St. Bonaventure University. And one of the people on my admissions interview happened to be a reserve Army major who also was on the ROTC scholarship selecting committee. And I made enough of an impression on him that at the end of the interview, he said, "We're going to admit you to school here. And if you'd like, we'll give you a 4-year ROTC scholarship also." So I don't want to say I stumbled my way into the Army. I knew that military service was on the horizon for me, but I a little bit stumbled my way into the Army because that guy, then Major Jim DeRizio, offered me that scholarship at the end of the interview.
There was a young individual out there we're thinking about being firefighters or astronauts and everything like that. So you knew you wanted to be in the service. Did you have a family history of that?
No, just the grandfathers that most of us have in the Second World War. And actually, I'm from New York City. And both of my parents, for a time, worked in the theater as casting directors and other things on Broadway shows. And that's about as far away from the U.S. military as you can get. However, some of the aspects of our later intelligence work that we all did together, I think the theatrical background that my family had actually ended up being an asset for me.
Colin, I never do that. That's freaking awesome, man.
Yeah, huge. My dad was the casting director for a show called Ain't Misbehavin' in 1976, which won the Tony Award for Best Musical. And he had quite a history in the theater, and I really think he was a little revolutionary in the 1970s in changing the direction of New York City theater. So again, not a road that I could walk or would necessarily want to walk, but I grew up in New York around theater people. And so probably the best job in the Army for me was to go into the type of intelligence work that we did actually.
So, all right, you're off to ROTC, and let's hear about it. What happened? How'd it go?
Yeah.
Where'd you end up?
The ROTC was a good experience. I think the majority of folks wanted to end up in the combat arms. I think that when you're an 18, 19, 20-year-old kid, you're sort of taught that the infantry and the armor and the field artillery is where you want to go. I wanted to go into military intelligence. I got that. I was branched military intelligence. However, I was detailed out to the Chemical Corps, and I did 3 years in the Chemical Corps. And I will never forget the looks of sorrow on everybody's face that were cadre in the ROTC world, because they thought my career was over. I was going to be miserable and I was going to leave the Army, because we know that being a Chemical Corps can be a challenge sometimes. I ended up getting assigned to 167 Armor Regiment, which was part of 2nd BCT, 4th Infantry Division. I was the battalion chemical officer there. And the first few months were terrible. So I was doing the unit status report and a whole bunch of other S3 functions that nobody wanted to do. But as the unit got ready to deploy in early 2005, we needed a new thing called a civil military affairs officer for the battalion, which was the S5, and then it transitioned to become the S9. And nobody in the armor world knew what that was or who should do that job. And I asked to do that job, and the battalion commander said, well, I'm going to give you a shot. And out at our last field exercise at Fort Hood, Texas, before we went off to NTC, there was an angry mock Iraqi crowd that nobody had been able to diffuse. And I went out there and worked with the mock sheikh and somehow figured out how to get this crowd to not want to storm our mock forward operating base. And so the battalion commander decided that I could do this job. And it ended up being a great job. I spent a little less than 12 months with that unit just south of Baghdad as the civil affairs officer, helping to stand up local governments. And I executed the commander's emergency relief program. So we provided humanitarian supplies, and we built schools and let contracts for roads. And that really was an extraordinary experience. And it could have been terrible to be the chemical officer in that unit. The guy who gave me that chance was a guy named Pat Donahoe. He retired as a 2-star. And I'm grateful to him. And he knows that also, but I'm grateful that he gave me the shot to take what could have been a bad year and make it an incredibly rewarding year. So when we got back, what I was really desperate to do at that point, like any other 22 or 23-year-old kid, was to lead soldiers. And as a chemical officer, that's a hard thing to do. There was a chemical battalion on Fort Hood at the time, 2nd Chemical Battalion. And Pat Donahoe, who was the battalion commander, was kind enough and thought enough of me to work with their battalion commander, who's a guy named Sven Eriksson. And it's funny that I remember that. Some things we never forget. And as Lieutenant Colonel Eriksson agreed to have me come over to 2nd Chemical Battalion to take a platoon. And it was going to be a smoke platoon, which was pretty cool. We could run around with the tanks. And then he found out that I was actually branched MI, and I was about to transition to MI, and they did not have an S2, so he made me the S2. And so I missed out on the opportunity to lead a platoon there. And I had to sort of figure out what an S2 was, because I had no intel training and I had no idea what I was doing. And there was a moment when I was giving the weather report, and I said, I don't think this is a good use of our time, so I'm not going to be giving the weather report in the future. And he told me that he still wanted the weather report, so I continued giving it. But that's how little I knew, and I was still a young enough lieutenant. And Lieutenant Colonel Donahoe gave me enough latitude that I had not learned that it was not my job to come into the meeting and tell them what they were going to be briefed on. So good learning experience from there. So I did that job. And you want me to keep going, Jeremy, or do you want to take a break?
Actually, can I ask you a question? Then I'll pass it over to Scott to ask a question.
Yeah.
Colin, I'll say, here you are, a young MI officer, not trained is probably more appropriate. Did you have a mentor at least?
I mean, I had not been to the schools, and the schools are what, in Army world
Qualification.
and I was not qualified.
So who was helping you kind of mentor and lead you to make sure you're given other things beyond the weather report?
There was an E7 there, Sergeant First Class Langston, and she was pretty good about helping me figure out what I ought to be doing. But she had grown up. This was still early in the Iraq and Afghanistan cycle, so her time in MI had been a lot of arms room inspections and sort of the garrison stuff. So she helped me through that, and I did do security clearance checks. I didn't really have anybody to help me sort through what an MI officer could do to help that battalion understand what an adversary might do. So I wanted to help that unit understand what kind of chemical weapons and how they would be employed by the North Koreans per se. But I didn't know what systems to go on to research that. We had a SIPR system. We didn't have a JWIX. The SIPR, we had to walk to a different trailer. I didn't even know how to log on to it. So I figured it out by the end, and Sergeant Langston helped, but there was a lot of just pushing buttons and figuring it out on my own.
That's awesome. Yeah, I got a couple of follow-ups, right? So here you are, you accidentally, you wanted to be an MI guy. So that's my first question is, I mean, you got what you wanted for, even though you were sent off to do, your initial tour, in another specialty area. So, first, what was it about, MI that, from Jump Street, when you first, joined the military, drew you to, that specialty. And then I guess my follow on, just so you can, transition easily is, one of the things that we like to say in CI is that, muddy boots experiences really, kind of inform us for the rest of our time, in the military. So, maybe just an anecdote, about, what that muddy boots experience, did for you, later on in your career, the lesson that you took away from it.
Yeah. So why I wanted CI, and the second question, so good, Scott, and I've got an answer for that also. Why I wanted CI, I really, even from the time I was young in the Army, wanted to play a part in helping people decide what we should do rather than just carrying out the decisions that other people had made. And again, I was young and naive, and I thought that as an MI lieutenant and captain, I would be helping make policy. And we know that that's far from the truth, but I had a vision of an MI officer that was studying the world, studying the nuances of situations, and then giving their best advice to a group of senior people who then would decide, but not before they listened to the MI person. And I wanted to be that person rather than waiting for the directions to come. I wanted to help shape the directions. So that's what pulled me to MI. And then the muddy boots experience, first of all, essential that everybody spends a little bit of time in a force comm unit. And I was grateful that I ended up there first. I joined headquarters company for 167 Armor when they were already in the field. And the tent that I was assigned to was full, except for one cot, which was right by the tent door. And all of the soldiers, when I got there, still wearing second lieutenant bar, said, "Hey, sir, we saved this spot for you." And I really believed that, this thing about being an officer, like these guys don't know me, but they're already taking care of me. They love me and they respect me already. And I realized as the night went on and I was freezing cold and I was covered in mud because it rained every day during that exercise, that they really didn't love the second lieutenant right away. And there was going to be a little bit of earning that I had to do. And that was an incredibly powerful moment for me because the guys weren't being mean, but they were reminding me that everything in the Army's got to be earned. And I didn't know that necessarily, when I showed up because the rank mattered, but the cold and the mud mattered more, and I learned that pretty quickly.
That's awesome.
You had a legit muddy boot story, Colin. Wow.
It was a legit, it was a muddy everything story. I was covered, and it took me probably until 2200 that night, after I had been lying in the cot for 2 hours, to realize that this was not an accident and that this was the worst place to be in this tent, and that was intentional.
So did they make it right, or did you endure the whole way and build some respect?
I stayed in that cot for I we were out there 7, I don't know if it was 6 or 7 more days. They had been out there for 4 or 5 already. I joined them late. But they made it right in the sense that at the end of that experience, the way that I'd handled it, but also the time that I spent with them, I do think they transferred a little bit of loyalty to me and a little bit of respect at that point. So I think they made it right by living up to their end of the bargain, which is if I live up to my end of the bargain and I earn it, then they're going to give it to me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Oh, well done. Hey, let me ask you this, Colin. You've set the foundation as a young lieutenant in FORSCOM, and I agree with you. I think every soldier should start there, whether it's an E or an O. I mean, you really get to understand the Army, and what we do in the Army is to make sure we help protect the soldier on the ground, no matter what discipline you're in. It's all about supporting that warfighter, that combat arms individual. But Colin, so you've set the foundation, and now you're about to transition into MI or CI. Walk us through that.
Yeah, I had I knew the type of MI that I wanted to do, which was the more strategic MI, but I didn't know where that was or how to get there. Um, and so I tried. I ended up meeting somebody who had been associated with a program that put people into strategic CI stuff, and they gave me a general rundown of what the prerequisites were. And one of the prerequisites at the time was to have a company command. And it could not be a battalion S2. You had to have a company command. And so I made it my mission to figure out how to get a company command. And I found it incredibly difficult as an MI captain to find out how to do that. So what I ended up doing was volunteering for a military transition team. And so that was, if you guys remember, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, they would take 7 people, put us through training for 90 days, and we'd go train an Iraqi or an Afghan unit. I was in Iraq training an Iraqi unit. But you got assignment of choice coming out of that job because it was a little bit of a hardship tour. And I used that assignment of choice to get myself to the 470th MI Brigade. And I really didn't know what I was going to do there, but I knew there were a lot of MI companies there. And I did end up taking one of those companies. And that was my first foray into strategic CI also, or strategic intel, because that was an interrogation company. And I had the chance to lead that company while we were deployed in Afghanistan. So I knew that I wanted to do strategic MI. I did the MIT team so that I could get myself to a place to meet the prerequisites to do it. And then in the course of getting those prerequisites, I found out that I was right, that I really did love that job, and that the IIRs that we produced out of that company did what I talked about earlier, which was helping people make decisions, which was always something that was important for me to do.
Man, that's awesome. I mean, you like checked off a whole bunch of buckets right there, right? So you basically volunteering for the hard job, to get where you want to go, right? I mean, how hard was that, decision? I mean, so I mean, people don't often think about this, right? But I mean, that is in many occasions throughout your military career, or any career, in government, certainly in the intelligence business, those who take the hard jobs are often rewarded.
Yeah.
And so what are your thoughts on that? Is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, it's fundamental to my worldview and fundamental to the way that I pursued my military career, is that you cannot have a sense of entitlement. It's same as the tent. You have to earn the respect, and you have to earn the consideration from the system and from the people that are around you. And so for me, I had just gotten back from a deployment with 167 Armor, and I was back in Iraq less than a year later on this mid team. But I knew that what I really wanted was going to take this kind of cost of entry, that I was going to have to give this before I could get the thing that I wanted. And I was very comfortable with that idea. And all throughout my career, I've been comfortable with that. And I really encourage people to put in the hard year to get the thing you want on the backside of it, rather than sitting around waiting for, in my case, the company command to appear that probably never would have appeared.
You're your own best advocate when you come into career advice and career trajectory and career progression. So well done, Colin.
Thanks.
So at 470th, where from there?
From 470th, I ended up from 470th. I went to Det 14. There was a year of training between the MIT team and going to 470th at Fort Huachuca, where I did the captain's career course, where I finally learned what IPB was, even though I'd already had a couple of MI jobs. And it was funny to watch me train the Iraqi intelligence apparatus on MI, and I had never one time been to an MI course, and I had a couple of manuals that I would carry around with me, look at it, and I would read page 7 and then go teach page 7 to the Iraqis. And that's sort of the way that I was trying. I think I did an okay job at it. But I had been at Battalion S2 and I trained intel to Iraqis, and I'd never been to an intel school. So I came back from the MIT tour, spent over a year at Fort Huachuca, where I did the career course and SciSac and Defense Strategic Debriefing course and G2X management course and a couple of other little things. And again, I had that time because Branch was grateful that I had volunteered so soon after getting back the first time to take that MIT tour. And I had done it easily and I never complained about it. So, they again lived up to their end of the bargain. They gave me plenty of time at Huachuca to do the schools that I wanted to do and got me to a unit where I could get a company command. That got me to 470th. And then from 470th, I'd applied to the program that staffs strategic jobs. Glenn Jones shepherded me through that process at the time. And I went to Det 14. And I will never forget Glenn Jones, actually. And I was having flashbacks when I was listening to him on your last 2 episodes, because I was sure that everything was progressing well in the acceptance process. And I was standing on a parade field at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and it was about 2 million degrees. And I got a call from Glenn Jones, and I thought, this is it. He's telling me I'm in and everything's good. And I picked up the phone while I was standing in front of my company, because we were parade rest on break. And I said, Glenn, I'm excited for what you're about to tell me. And he said, oh, we've got a problem. And I kind of doubled over a little bit. And the guys thought that I was passing out because it was really hot that day. I was not passing out. I was just disappointed. But, to Glenn's credit, and it speaks to the type of people that we had in our community, this little hiccup we had, which was a battalion, one of the battalion commanders I had did not enthusiastically recommend me. Others had. And that's a theme in my career, to be honest with you, is I've been a little controversial. And this one battalion commander did not recommend me. And so Glenn had to work through that with General Lejeune at the time. And he could have moved on to another candidate. And he could have said, it's not worth it for me to figure this out. But Glenn flew down to Texas. And I don't know if he interviewed 60 or 100 of my soldiers, but he got to know me by getting to know my company. And I was close to that group of guys. And I think that showed him what he needed to know about me to become a strong advocate for me. So I'm grateful to Glenn. I'll never forget that, because that was what opened the door for me to do so many of these other things that mattered to me later. And the type of people I found in our community were that way. And it's why I was so proud to be part of it, and why, all these years later, we're still talking now together, because there just was a certain type of person that was drawn to this. And there was a certain sense of honor and a certain sense of loyalty that was very impressive. And I saw it right away, because Glenn could have said, not worth it, but he didn't do that. He talked to my entire company. And from there, the rest of my career was able to happen.
Yeah, that's awesome. Glenn is always talking and preaching people. Get to know your people. Everybody's going to be a little different. He did the right thing to make sure you get in there. That is fantastic, Colin. So here you are as a young CO, case officer, doing Army operations. How did that go? Especially transition from the 470th, kind of strategic assignment, but now you're working with some graybeards, and now you're probably one king salmon in a pond of many.
Yeah. There were a mix of graybeards there, and I would say the graybeard that I learned the most from at that time was Nate Young, who was an executive case officer. Um, and I worked. He ended up being assigned to a case that I was working because we were short people, and we were flying down to Florida. And we would go smoke cigars after the meetings were done. And and it's cliche to tell these stories about the young guy that's having a drink and smoking a cigar with the older guy, but there is a piece of who I am that came from those cigars and those whiskeys, reasonable number of whiskeys, with Nate Young that has stayed with me forever. And the reality is, it's not every graybeard. And there were people in Det 14 who were well intentioned, but if I look back on them, they really did not have that effect on me. And I'm not sure that they were wholly effective themselves in their work. So there's always a gradient of professionals in any organization. We had a number of really talented people, but I would never say that everybody is the best. But I will say that we had people like Nate, who could take a young guy and, after working with him for a couple of years, really turn him into somebody that knew the business, and more than just knew how to do the mechanics of the business, understand the reasons why we were doing this. And the passion that I have for the job that stays with me now, even after I'm retired, really comes from Nate talking about what we could accomplish if we did this well. And Scott, I know in Det 15 that there are guys that felt the same way when you were running that organization. And Jeremy, I know from our time in the three shop that there were guys who passed through the three shop that were equally inspired by the time that they had with you. So we had people like you two and like Nate, who created a generation that came behind you. And it's in our bones and in our blood because of what Nate and your generation sort of did just a little bit before us.
There's a lot to be said about passion, especially passion for our craft, Colin, and you have it 100%. And it's not a 9 to 5 job. It's you live and you breathe this.
That's right.
There is every waking minute of the hour you're thinking about it. And even sharing a cigar and a whiskey, I guarantee you probably drew some ideas up on a bar napkin, like Scott and I setting our company up. That's where the best things happen. The creative juices flow. True mentorship, I think, happens outside the booth just as much as it does in the office.
Yeah, it's 1,000% right. And as you're saying that, I have memories of, after my reasonable number of whiskey or whiskeys, offering some of those ideas. And Nate was a stoic guy, and you guys know Nate well. And I remember him kind of pulling back just a little bit and saying, "Yeah, we're not going to do that." And so he was also able to put the left and right limits on some of my most creative ideas, but was very, very, very encouraging in other of my creative ideas. And there was an operation that I designed as a captain. It didn't end up working out in the end, but it could have. And I'm proud of the effort I made. And that only happened because Nate said, "Yeah, let's give this thing a shot." So he gently said no to many things, but also pushed me in other ways.
Yeah, that's an awesome story. We often talk about, mentorship and formal mentorship programs and picking your own mentor. And I would say that within, at least in the Army, within FCA, and I know I went to DIA after that, that's one of the beauties of that position, the executive case officer position, because
That's right.
it's not a formalized mentorship program, but in many ways, that's what it ends up, being, right? Because you've got, somebody that's, steeped in the craft, taking on somebody, and if they're young and hungry and open and willing to accept, some guidance, it's like the perfect situation to, sort of set up a mentor-mentee relationship.
What's so special about that ECO position also is that it's not in the chain of command. So Nate wasn't evaluating me. He wasn't rating me. My career wasn't tied to our relationship. And so it wasn't distorted by some of the other things that shape professional relationships as we have to do things to get promoted or think about how we're coming across to a boss. So the position was incredibly, incredibly powerful, Scott. And I listened to Mike and Sean talk about the CCWO position on the last episode that you guys did. I'm not in love with the CCWO position, and I know there are mixed emotions all around. One of the reasons why I'm not in love with it is because it takes some of our most seasoned professionals away from jobs like executive case officer, where they can do the mentorship that the CCWO is supposed to do, but they can do it in the context of the operation. And I think we lost a little bit of that when we put all those senior guys into those CCWO positions.
Amen, brother. I preach it the same thing, right? I didn't get to voice my opinion on that because I didn't want to get beat up by 3 W5s because they could spar with the best of them, but that would have been a little much. Colin, as you're kind of laying the foundation of understanding how to be an offensive counterintelligence case officer, what are some of those key lessons that you learned early on in your career, just as you were working with Nate, you were doing some operations and, again, establishing the foundation?
Yeah. Every person that you work with in this business is different. So that goes for the partner while we're running the operation, but it certainly goes for whoever the asset is that we're using. And you have to, by the expressions on your face and by the words that are coming out of your mouth, you have to let them know that you care about them. Because so many things we do in the intelligence world and in the counterintelligence world is ask people to do things for a greater purpose that are not necessarily in their best interest and are not necessarily going to make their life better or easier. And if you ask them to do those things without establishing a personal connection with them, you're going to lose them eventually, and they're never going to give their best. And so we always used to talk about building rapport, and your generation always trained the younger guys coming behind you on the need for that. But you can interpret it correctly or incorrectly. And what I mean by that is building rapport can become a structural thing that we budget a certain amount of time for at the start and the end of a meeting. And I've seen that happen. I've seen guys say, well, for this 10 minutes, we're building rapport. Then we're going to do our operational work. And then we're going to build rapport at the end. And I think it fails terribly. And I think the person sitting across the table from us knows, oh, it's rapport time. And I think we've lost him at that point. You have to, rapport exists in every single utterance that's coming out of our mouth. And every meeting is going to have to take diversions, and it's going to have to take sidetracks, because rapport means if this person wants to talk about this, I'm genuinely interested in it. Not because I have to be, but because I remember what this person's doing for the nation, what they're doing for our unit. And so that makes me care about this person. And so we're not checking any boxes. It's a genuine relationship.
You're right. Rapport isn't bringing maybe a piece of is their favorite Taco Bell menu item number 4, or Subway sandwich, or here's a Coke. It's just being a professional, dressing appropriately, building confidence through having an appropriate agenda built, not wasting their time. I think you're right, Colin. Rapport is just beyond that superficial level. True rapport is getting to know somebody and appreciate somebody, so much so you're sacrificing your time in making sure you're the constant professional in that engagement.
I told you guys before that at Det 14 we had amazing people, but there's still various levels of people. But along those lines, I remember working with somebody who was years ahead of me, who was getting Subway sandwiches before a meeting, and I asked why we were getting the Subway sandwiches, and he said, first of all, he looked at me like I was stupid, and he said, for rapport, as if that was the answer, and we were then going to move on to other things. But Subway sandwiches, to your point, are not for rapport. They're so we're not hungry. The conversation is how we build rapport and establish relationships. And I'm laughing. People won't see this video, but I remember distinctly being looked at like I was an idiot for not understanding that the Subway sandwiches were for rapport.
Yeah, the objective of rapport is really trust. And, Subway sandwiches do not create trust. They solve a problem, but they do not create trust. And we create trust. We create trust for a reason, right? I mean, sooner or later, we're going to put that trust to the test, right? Because trust is easy when everything's groovy, right? But sometimes things get tough.
That's right.
When things get tough, well, that's when trust is tested. So you have to have invested in it, and you have to be real with it, or you're not going to have it when you need it. So,
and the idea that things are going to get tough, that for me is what always made the interactions genuine because they were going to get tough. And I remembered what I was going to put this other human being through. And so if I was going to put this human being through this hard thing, then I had to be there with them throughout the process. And it did mean that they were not hungry, so they would get a Subway sandwich, but that certainly was not going to check the rest of the relationship boxes that we had to establish.
Subway sandwich. I got a funny story about that, Colin, and I want to share with you, brother, because I recall getting somebody taking over a case, and it was Subway sandwich just like that all the time.
It might have been the same partner we had. I mean, they were around for a while, Jeremy. So
it might have been. I remember asking the individual we were meeting, like, "Hey, I brought you some Subway stuff. Is there anything else you want for the future? Anything different?" They responded back with, "I don't even like Subway. I only eat it because you keep bringing it."
well, your answer should have been very clear, like, "Hey, guy, don't you understand? I'm bringing this for rapport. Just lay it out and be honest, you know."
Rapport check. Next.
That's right. That's right. But the point is, it's funny for us, and we're laughing because we remember when rapport went wrong and we were checking the box. But the point is really important for folks that are listening to understand that you cannot, if rapport appears on an agenda for a meeting, I think that we're wrong. I think that we're wrong. And that's not, if you want to use the first 10 minutes to talk about somebody's mother who had been sick, then you can put that on there as a reminder. But that's not a block of rapport. That's you being a human to another human being.
Yeah, you're going to build that trust through actual human engagement. Colin, as you looked and set the foundation at Def 14, where'd you go after that, man?
I did 3.5 years at Def 14. So I was lucky because I was also one of the last generation of officers that had sort of a longer foundation. I left Def 14 and then went off to Command General Staff College. I did a few months in between that as the chief of plans at 902nd while I was waiting for CGSC. So I worked with then Lieutenant Colonel Stinson, obviously the ACIC commander now, which is a wonderful development. I'm glad that he's there. So I did that at 902nd for a few months, did a year at CGSC, and then came back to Fort Meade as the commander of the U.S. Army Special Investigations Detachment. And I was the commander there for about 6 months, and then also became the commander of the Direct Support Detachment as that unit was navigating some challenges, and the battalion and brigade commander at the time thought that a little bit of leadership oversight and enthusiasm might help just right their ship a little bit. They were an extraordinary group of people that just needed to be redirected a tiny bit for them to excel, and they did end up excelling. So I commanded both those two detachments simultaneously for, I don't know if it was 14 or 15 months, but as I was leaving, we stood up an organization called Special Service Activity, which was really a company level within the 308th MI Battalion that had a major as the commander. And the purpose of SSA was to house the SID, Investigations Detachment, DSD, Direct Support Detachment, and we had stood up a small cyber organization, nascent, because this is 2016 or 17, that would support both of those other two detachments. And SSA then would be sort of the company headquarters above them. And that lasted all the way through CI reform. So there were, Brian Brennan followed me, I think Sid Arias did it. There were at least 2 other, maybe 3 other officers who followed me as the SSA commander. And then things changed as CI reform took hold.
That's great. How was that experience? Here you are going from a strategic operational assignment, you go to CGSC, and now you're transitioning back to an investigative mindset, and then pulling in a kind of another operational arm back in as well.
Yeah, I loved it. And I loved it because it showed the diversity of CI, where I really would start my day on a Monday talking about where we have an expectation of privacy before we can search somebody's desk at work. And I would end it talking about an operation that we were going to run to support a special access program. And I would talk to general officers and members of the senior executive service because they were the executors of these special access programs that we were supporting. And as a major who was, really a few months out of CGSC, that was an extraordinary experience. And when I look at what I was doing compared to what most of my peers were doing when they left CGSC. They were grinding as battalion XOs and S3s, but they were not touching big army in the way that I was as a still relatively young major. And I took a lot of pride in that and a lot of satisfaction from that. And that's a special thing about our field, is that we've got all these jobs you can do that as a relatively junior person, you interact with very senior people and you do get to shape policies.
Man, that's fantastic. I mean, you've still relatively young in your career, as you're saying, but you've basically been exposed now to the full spectrum of counterintelligence activities that you kind of conduct across the board. We always talk about the fact that CI is, there's a lot to CI. We got 5 different functions within CI. So, can you talk a little bit about the complementary nature of all the different things that you have been exposed to?
Yeah, I think when you're running investigations, it helps you understand how people spy. And when you're running operations, it's important to understand how to convince folks that spying is happening. And so each of these things that we do gives us an insight that we can use in one of the other disciplines. And I ended up doing a couple of human tours also. And so as a guy who would go out and try to collect information from adversaries, it helped me understand where I was most vulnerable as I was doing that, so that when I would rotate back to a CI assignment, I would know where we could spend our time to catch the guy who was doing what I had been trying to do a year ago. And so I really do think that the ability to move between our disciplines, and if you're able to touch on some of the other broader MI disciplines, I think you come back a much more capable CI professional, because you know what the other side is trying to do. And then you know how to protect against it because you've tried to do it yourself.
Colin, you're a lucky individual. I mean, to be dual trained like that. So where did that fall in the career, and how did that unfold?
Well, first I will say, and I've talked a lot about how much Glenn Jones means to me, and now I'll tell you something that Glenn Jones absolutely drove me up the wall about. He was not a dual trained supporter. So I had wanted to be dual trained, and Glenn, everybody has a vision of sort of what the officer track ought to be. And Glenn really, for all the right reasons, wanted us to stay invested in CI. And he had reasons that made a lot of sense. I didn't agree with them necessarily, and I still don't agree with them. But his reasons were deep and true to who he was and what he believed. And so I kept asking, and he kept saying no. And there was a shift when Sean took over. Sean Michaud had a different view, and I think his view was a little closer to mine of the more experience you have spying, the better you are at protecting against spying. And so he was willing to send me out into the world if I got selected to do the human training and then go out and do 1 or 2 human tours, which I did do 2 tours with the human guys. One of them was operational and one was managing human operations, but both of them helped quite a bit in understanding that world. So I spent a year doing human training, including the Joint Military Attaché course, DIA headquarters. And then I went out to spend a year as assistant army attaché at the embassy in Baghdad, which was not a traditional army attaché job. But in a way, things moved so fast in Baghdad that I had the chance to do things that might have taken 3 or 4 years to do other places. And so the level of experience that I got in a short amount of time, I thought was really useful. And because Iraq in 2017 and 2018 was still such a focus of U.S. foreign policy, there was a huge interagency presence at the embassy in Iraq. And so if you name a 3-letter intelligence agency, I have personal experience working with somebody on some project from that agency. And I got all of that in the year that I spent in Baghdad, because we were just doing so much on a daily basis there. And they were all co-located at the embassy with me. And so I came back from that tour, Jeremy, and ended up working with you as the 3 of FCA.
That must have been miserable. So let's see. Let's talk about. No,
It was a moderately good experience.
no, that's awesome, man. So I mean, so you kind of alluded to the fact that you brought experience back, to from having done the collection piece. Now you're back into the CI world. Are there any do you have any like aha moments where it really came together, or is it kind of what's the deal there?
I think the aha moment that I had was the pressure that I felt when I was on the street trying to collect. In CI operations, we're not always, sometimes we are, but we're not always the person that's actually trying to do the act. Oftentimes we're working through other people, not always, but often. And so just the pressure of having to do it and what that felt like, I think did a lot to help me understand the human emotions that our assets go through as we ask them to do things. And I do think that helped whenever I would plan operations or whenever I would look and say, we need to slow this operation down. A lot of that came from me remembering what it felt like to have to do some of these things and to recognize that, hey, maybe we can't ask this guy to do this thing tomorrow because I bet I know what it feels like for him right now. And I didn't have that fully until I had actually done the collections myself.
There is something to be said about. Go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that's an awesome, perspective, right? I mean, as counterintelligence professionals, we're trying to counter the adversary, but to really truly counter them and to do it in a really, and we need to take advantage of what high ground we own. And one piece of that high ground is just what you're talking about, is the collector is under pressure.
That's right.
They're under pressure to collect. They have somebody that they answer to. They have to win, right? So sometimes people do things, they make mistakes. So we go up against very capable adversaries. Is what it boils down to. But they're not infallible, and they have their own pressures, and we have to understand that to be able to defeat them.
Yeah, and I was looking at it from what you're saying is right. And I have a comment, Scott, about what you just said. I was looking at it from the, can the asset do this? Because it's already taken so much out of them emotionally. But you're exactly right that as you're designing an operation, when bosses are changing and people are about to go home to Moscow or Beijing or wherever it is, they are under pressure to produce results because they have an evaluation that's about to be written on them. And I remember, now I wasn't going to get shot in a basement in Moscow if I didn't produce, but I remember as I got close to the end of my tour, there is a certain type of pressure that develops to produce something. If you want to get a certain type of evaluation, if you want to prove yourself. And for CI people that are designing operations, we should pay a lot of attention to when people are rotating back home or when their bosses are about to rotate home, because it does put a different type of pressure on people to produce that can be useful to people that are running CI operations.
Spot on.
Yeah. So, Colin, here you are back at the activity. It was a rather tumultuous time, to say the least. How did you endure?
Yeah, I endured really well, and I endured really well partly because our offices were right next to each other, and I had a great partnership with you. Learned a tremendous amount from you, but always knew that whatever decision I made as the three, after you had made your case and argued your case and whatever wherever we were, that you were going to aggressively try to implement that for me. There were some conversations that I heard with the CW5s over the last couple of episodes that really stressed this. But I will tell you from the officer perspective how important it is to know that after the argument, respectful argument, but after the argument, that senior warrant officer is going to get on the VTC and not say, hey, the boss wants us to do this stupid thing, but to own it. But to own it as if we had an argument and I won and you're convinced. And that was something, Jeremy, that you always did. And so that made my job easy. The other thing that made my job easy was you had an equal passion for the job that matched my own. And if you remember, and I know you do, at that time, there were a lot of people that did not believe in the mission and really could have cared less if the mission even continued. And when I got there, we had just started running operations again. And I think if I had been there with somebody who was apathetic, or if they didn't get the importance of this work, or if they were so cynical that they had quit trying, I think that would have drained me. But that's the opposite of what I found in you. And our offices were next to each other, and you worked those VTCs every minute of every day to try to make things happen on behalf of FCA and on behalf of the nation. And I derived energy from that. And that's the type of person that I wanted to work with. And so they were tumultuous times. And they actually became even more tumultuous in a way when you left, because then we went into and I took it, I argued as much as a senior by then major could argue. I wrote white papers. I made every case I could that we should not decentralize it. And that was not a necessarily pleasant experience to go through, being one of the few voices. I wasn't the only one. Scott Bailey, as the XO, was there. There were others that were arguing with me. But it was a lonely place to be as the sort of tide of CI reform was washing over FCA. I really was yelling in the wind until the last day. And I'm proud of it, but it was a challenging, that became probably the most challenging time. You had just departed, and we were just getting crushed with the why do you exist? And I know why we existed, and I believed in our purpose, but that was not well understood outside of our organization.
Yeah, maybe the Army will figure it out and kind of revert back to what happened. Why SOD came to the equation to begin with, breaking it down, putting it under one umbrella. The Army goes rolling along. Hopefully they'll figure it out. But Colin, it was an absolute pleasure to work with you there. I saw you go toe-to-toe with the most senior individuals in the Pentagon and defend a case. And you defended it till the end. You defended it so well. The 3-star general, General Barrier at the time, looked at you and said, Lieutenant Colonel, you're right. This is what we're going to do. And everybody else in the room was, because the times were difficult, just kind of shook their head. Huge win for operations at the time. And it was awesome to see you do that, Colin. And thank you for standing up and always doing the right thing.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. You prepped me well. I mean, I remember going into that. I understood why that case mattered because you had done such a good job of explaining it to me. And so then it just took a little bit of enthusiasm on my part to make that case. But Jeremy, you gave me the foundation. You gave me all the facts that I needed to make that case. And so when I say that I enjoyed my time with you, I mean, that's a perfect example of a really good outcome that came from you and I working together.
Yeah, I think we worked well together. We got to stick it to the adversary, and that's what it's all about. We
Right.
protected the U.S. Army because we were both passionate about it.
Right.
As you're looking to move on to the next assignment, where did that lead you to, Colin?
Where did I go after that? I left FCA S3 in a cloud of controversy and dust as I fought to the death to keep FCA alive. And I quickly hightailed it out to Baghdad again to get out of the controversy and dust. And I hid out in Baghdad for 7 months as the CJ2X, the director of CI and Human for Operation Inherent Resolve, which by then was operating in Iraq and also in Syria also. And we had some guys in Jordan, and we were kind of spread out all over the Middle East. But that again that was a human tour. So that was staffed by human officers. So I could do that because I was a dual trained guy. But the CI guys were so happy to have a CI officer filling that role. And I will never forget that mouths open that a CI guy had shown up to do that job. And so I'd like to think that I pushed the CI mission there in a way that some of the human guys might not have known how to do. And I'd like to think I managed the human ops relatively well also. But that was a chance to take the CI operational experience I had, the human operational experience I had by actually doing the job, and then manage it in what was still a pretty hostile environment, a dynamic environment. And I did that for 7 months. And I did that again out of the embassy in Baghdad with people that were scattered kind of left and right all over the place. And it gave me a chance to check in on some of the operations that I had played a part in Baghdad several years prior. And I was very glad to see that most of them were still working. And I told everybody where they had either messed them up or not done them as well as I would have done. But they had mostly held them together.
I love it. And then go ahead, Scott.
No, I was just going to transition to the next. What? That's awesome. But where did you end up landing after coming home from Baghdad?
I came back and I was actually getting ready to do another tour, and I was going to go to Mali. I was on orders to go to Mali again, and I was waiting. So I was on the commander's action group at INSCOM. So I worked for General Legier there for 6 or 7 months, and ended up getting picked up for battalion command. And so that preempted the Mali assignment. And I ended up not doing that, which I'm a little disappointed over because the Army kept paying for me to go learn French and I never got to use it. And I still do Duolingo every single day, but I find it atrophying a little bit more every day also. But I got picked up for battalion command and then waited until it was time for that for a few more months on the commander's action group. And that also gave me a chance to sort of see the INSCOM headquarters. I had seen the G2 from being the SID commander, and Jeremy from our time at FCA. We used to go up for the quarterlies. I had not spent time at INSCOM headquarters, and that gave me a chance to sort of see how that worked for better and for worse. But at least I had a clearer picture of what that organization was all about.
Yeah, we talk about kind of being at the headquarters element, and we go kicking and screaming as operators and passions of the craft, and there's nobody better positioned that has done multiple tours in both, in your case, CI and HUMIT, to go ahead and help the general understand through policy or writing it, directives or policy, whatever it's been. That's pretty fantastic, Colin. As you look back at your career, what is that one time that you're going to be the most memorable?
There was an Iraqi that I was working with. My daughter was born when I was away, so I was not home when she was born. And there was an Iraqi that I had a relationship with, and I was in Kurdistan meeting with this person, and he was the first person outside of my wife who had called me that I said, "Oh, my daughter was just born." And he had a gift with him that by chance that he had intended to give to somebody else that he was going to see later, and it happened to be a little gold bracelet. And by coincidence, he had this just for the rest of his day, and he ended up giving me the gold bracelet for Claire, my daughter. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that moment that I had earned that kind of consideration from him, and I did care about him deeply, and we really had done impressive things together and worked together well. But the emotion on his face reminds me, when I think about it to this day, the power of the relationships that we as intelligence professionals establish with human beings and what they will do for us that benefits our country if we build those relationships well. And that moment crystallized that for me, and it stays with me.
That's super powerful, Colin. It's interesting, sort of weave throughout a lot of the stories that you have told. You speak a lot about, relationships, empathy, compassion, kind of understanding, who the other person is and what drives them so that they can, do what needs to be done to be their best first self, to get the mission done, whatever it is, right? So I also seem to recall that, I think that you were involved, maybe it was when you were on that CAG, right, in developing a program there was like a lot of suicides with the Army went through a period, and you developed sort of a wellness program, for INSCOM.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we have talked about outside of, CI press is, the wellness within the ranks is sometimes a catalyst for people to do things that they might not otherwise have done, to commit espionage, to become an insider threat.
Yeah.
I mean, can you just give us some thoughts on, how that's such a huge problem, and we're not going to solve it here, but can you offer some thoughts on what, we could maybe think about or do about that
Yeah.
problem?
I want to very briefly, I just want to also just bring up, and we probably don't have time to talk about all of it, but I want to just put here on the record also, my Army career ended when I was relieved from battalion command. And I was relieved from battalion command. And there's a reason, Scott, why I'm telling you this, because there were a group of people that felt that I didn't have enough empathy and that I didn't relate to them well. And so I want to say that because there is a theme that's common for me, and I do treasure people, but I don't get everything right all of the time either. And it's really hard to manage hundreds and thousands of relationships over a career. And the best we can do is to just do the best that we can do. But I just, for transparency's sake, as we're talking about this, I just want to do justice to my career and just share that happened. There's a chapter I wrote in a book called Mentorship Mastery. I wrote chapter 4 of that book. I think the subtitle is Holistic Guide for Virtuous Leaders. And it talks about what the experience of being relieved from command was like emotionally for me, some reflections on what I learned from it. And if folks are interested in what it's like to go through a challenge like that, then they can find that book. It's on Amazon as a digital download or as a paperback copy. But as we're talking about empathy, Scott, it's important to me. I'm an honest person. I just want everybody to know that not everybody in the world would say that I'm the most empathetic person in the world. But I do care very deeply about people, and even the people that were on the other side of the issue that led to my relief, I love them. I wish the best for them, and I always will. Back to wellness. I think that people need to feel that they're not alone. And I think that espionage can come when people feel alone, forgotten, underappreciated. And we knew that. We always understood that if you can't make somebody feel appreciated, somebody else will make them feel appreciated. And so from a practical standpoint, it just makes sense for the Army and for the community writ large to build meaningful relationships with our people that have access to classified information so that somebody else doesn't take care of them. We have to take care of them so that somebody else doesn't meet their emotional needs. That's the practical reason for doing it. The deeper reason for doing it is that this job is hard. Any job in the IC is hard. You're isolated from the rest of the world oftentimes. And if we don't take care of each other, then we do end up feeling alone. And we have a responsibility to take care of other people in the intelligence community, because guess what? Nobody but us can do it, because nobody but us understands what we're doing every day and what that feels like. And one of the things that I miss so much about FCA was the camaraderie that existed in that organization. And I felt it as a young guy when I showed up there, that we didn't all get along all of the time, but we really did love each other pretty deeply. And we really, really would not let an FCA person dangle in the world by themselves and feel like they were disconnected from a community. And I see in a lot of other Army units, and now as somebody who's retired, that people do go to work and then they do go home and they are disconnected from the organization that they're part of. And I don't think that's necessarily the best way from a human standpoint to be, but from a practical CI standpoint, if people feel alone, somebody from the other side is going to make them not feel alone. So we ought not let that happen.
Scott just published an article about Monica Witt, and we actually did a podcast about it. And I think you described her to a T.
That's right.
Because she felt alone, and the adversary took advantage of that. And ultimately, she betrayed our country and her fellow brothers and sisters in arms.
That's right.
She felt lonely.
Yeah, I never want to excuse what somebody like what Witt did, but there are things we can do to intervene. She wasn't born to be a spy. Now, some of us will never spy. She had it in her to do it, but there are things that might have happened on her journey that might have led her to make a different decision if we had met some of those needs. And it was hard when I was designing the INSCOM wellness program, because I still to this day am not convinced that we can put a program in place to make people feel included and taken care of. And what we had at FCA, and what I've seen a few other places, but it certainly existed in FCA, it was organic and it was real. And so Jeremy and I had not spoken in a number of years. But when we connected recently on LinkedIn and now through the podcast, it's as if I saw him yesterday, and that will never go away because the relationships were organic and real. And so the appeal that I always make to people is, yes, there's a wellness program. The Army even has a wellness manual right now. You can reference that for resources. There are things you can learn from it, but please try to get to know the people that you're serving with and really be there for them and really care about that other human being, because that's the only way that they're going to not feel isolated.
Well said, Colin. I agree. And looking back at my time at the activity, some of the best friends that I have came from that. And enduring the hard times, enduring the passion, the love of the craft, the love of the people, it all kind of stemmed from there. Colin, we are coming up on time, but I have a couple questions, and I'm sure
Sure.
Scott does as well. So, as you look back at your career, and for our audience out there, what are those one or two pieces of advice you wish you knew or wished you were armed with that you can pass along?
I tell people now to really think through the issues that they will martyr themselves over. And what I mean by that, and you talked a little bit about my willingness to go toe to toe with seniors, and you referenced the case when it worked out, but I was relieved from battalion command. Okay, so it doesn't always work out. And I really encourage people to think through, under what circumstances will I put it all on the line? In that particular case, the nation needed that operation to continue. So if my career was damaged in the course of protecting that operation, it was worth it. There have been other fights that I've engaged in that, as I look back, some of them I won, some of them I didn't. But as I look back on them, the consequences were not that dire, and I could have given a little bit on those issues to preserve political capital for another time. So I encourage people to just think through, before putting all their political chips on the table, is this the thing that I want to risk everything on? And often the answer is yes. And then you have to risk everything. You cannot step back at that point, but just make sure that it reaches that criteria.
I love that, Colin. It's sound advice, and I would take it one step further. Once you make that decision, maybe step away from your computer before you go ahead and hit send, or you have to walk next door and go to the major and say, "Sir, I apologize. I probably shouldn't have sent that. I was a little heated."
Jeremy, it's a perfect point, because actually a rule that I have, and this hasn't always worked, but I didn't communicate any of those feelings over email. And so if you're not willing to walk into somebody's office or drive to Fort Belvoir or drive to the Pentagon and say it standing in front of them, don't say it in an email. So if it's a controversial thing, you watched me in the Pentagon say it to their face. We were 5 feet apart from each other. I wouldn't have emailed that. And I think that's a good rule to live by. If it's controversial, if it might be a problem, don't hit send. You have to go walk into their office and say it. And if you're not willing to do that, that's a sign that it's not the thing to martyr yourself over, and it's a sign that it doesn't meet that first criteria that I referenced.
Solid advice, brother. For our audience, if they wanted to outreach to you, how could they do that?
I'm on LinkedIn, and my email address is colinjpascal@outlook.com, all one word, no spaces, and I'm happy to talk to anybody that's doing this job. And I've got a ton of respect for folks that are still out in the field doing this job.
Scott, I have one more question, and I'm going to give it over to you to ask your questions. So between counterintelligence and human intelligence, you're dual trained. Which one's better?
They're different. Given the choice, I would stay as a CI officer. And I went to get the dual training to become a human officer so that I could do CI better. And the reason why I feel that way is because we can collect a lot of information in the human world that's going to marginally improve our chances of winning the next war or helping us make better decisions. But if we fail at CI, we are going to lose the next war. If we lose our new technologies, if we lose our war plans, we are going to lose the next war. And so the stakes to me in CI versus human are different. Human is an enabler for us to do something better. CI is existential. If they get what we have, we will lose. And for that reason, I was always inspired and committed to stay on the CI track, even though I enjoyed it. Human, tons of respect for what those guys do, but the stakes were different, and I wanted to be where I thought the stakes were higher.
That's awesome. No doubt. And you're talking to a couple of CI guys, so we agree with you wholeheartely on that opinion.
Text messages from some not CI.
Yeah. So I think you did the whole you, me, same, pulled it on us right there. All right. So all right. Mine's got a little bit of, so your career, you retired and you've moved on. You're now in the, you're no longer tied to the military directly anyway.
Yeah.
You now run your own real estate, development company. All right. So what's harder to deal with? A hostile source or a home inspector with a clipboard? And
the home inspector with a clipboard is a real challenge. And I would like to think that all of my training could have prepared me for that, but that is a lie. And it has not prepared me for any of that, actually. And I do most of my work in Washington, D.C., actually with Katie Bergeron, who does part-time real estate. And actually, she's been a joy to deal with and really has given me a leg up on a number of deals that I wouldn't have had otherwise. But again, that speaks to the relationships we build in our field. But working in Washington, D.C. is a challenge. And the guy with the clipboard is the real deal. And all the training in the world will not help you overcome that easily. I promise you that, Scott.
Well, I'm sure you're going to win anyway, right? So fantastic, man. It's been awesome. Appreciate it, Colin.
Thanks.
Hey, Colin, I want to end with a couple of different things, right? Your drive, communication, and dedication were motivating. I saw it firsthand. From your time in muddy boots sitting next to the entryway to the time you were wearing suits, getting after our most aggressive adversaries, helping commanders make those informed risk decisions, earning the respect by taking the hard jobs, doing the hard rec, doing those complex opportunities, full spectrum counterintelligence from operations investigations to leading multiple tours, so much so you even went to the human side. You're a true master of the craft. Thank you for your dedication and your service and your friendship throughout the years, brother. Thank you for joining us on Cypress, man. And I can't wait to get you back on board to talk about another book that you have up and coming and the articles you're writing out there.
Yeah, it's what you guys are doing is so important, and I want the whole country to know about CI, and you guys make it incredibly approachable. So it's technical enough for those of us that grew up in the business that were challenged by the ideas, but it's approachable enough for people that didn't grow up in CI to start to understand the craft. So thank you for what you're doing, because you're putting out an important message, and thanks for the chance to participate in this with you. And I look forward to being back.
Fantastic. Hey, listen, if you love CI, we want you to check out IXN Dispatch on Patreon and join our community. It's patreon.com/IXN Dispatch. With a free membership, you get access to episodes of CI Press, just like this one, the second they drop, as well as tons of CI-focused content. We have paid memberships with a couple of different tiers. With those, you can access Dispatch Central, which is our Discord community, with unprecedented access to exclusive content, chat, video sessions with the IXN team and your fellow CI pros and enthusiasts. Just remember, when you join as a paid member, again, that's patreon.com/dispatch. You got to scroll down to the bottom of the sign up page, and that's where you're going to either sign up for or link your current Discord account to get access to the Discord channel.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. So for our audience out there, Scott and I both got them on. We got some No Spy. We got I Love Screening Flow and Logic shirts on. We got to get Colin one. We got to get our guests some here so that they can participate in our Printify offering. For our audience out there, thanks for giving us a listen. Follow us on LinkedIn. Check out our website, www.ixnsolutions.com. If you have a topic you want the IXN team to discuss, send it our way, man. I'm telling you, we'd love to chat about it. And more importantly, if you want to be a guest, we can most certainly make that happen. Thanks for giving us a listen, and until next time.